Hi, Reagan.
Christine, this is Shayna from our office. I mentioned she would be shadowing us during the meeting tonight.
Hi, Shayna. Nice to meet you. I'm Christine.
Shayna will not be able to unmute herself because we're not making her a co-host, so she will wave. Thank you for letting us.
Oh, of course. Of course. Amanda, since I made you the host, I can't stop the recording. I don't know if you want to do that just during this. And welcome to the Lowell Parking Study Neighborhood Meeting for Centralville and Pawtucketville. I would like to remind everybody of, well, I guess before I remind everybody of the rules for participating, I should tell you who I am. My name is Christine McCall, and I'm the Director of Economic Development for the city. So let's begin. I would like to remind everyone of the rules for participating in this meeting, as well as remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. Next slide. We have interpreters who are translating the meeting tonight into Spanish, Portuguese, and Khmer. If you require these services, please click the interpretation button on your screen. It's the globe icon, and select which language you wish to hear. At this moment, I will ask all English speakers to please select English as their chosen language. This will allow you to hear translated non-English comments during the Q&A. Next slide. You can view closed captions by clicking the closed captions feature and selecting from the options shown. Show subtitle will display a caption at the bottom of the screen. View full transcript will display the meeting's audio transcription and a window to the right. Next slide. You may use the chat button to submit a typed question or comment at any point during the meeting. We will be monitoring the chat during the presentation, but ask that you hold comments and questions for the breakout discussions that we will be having later in this meeting. If you have a technical problem, please share your issues in the chat feature at any point during the meeting, and we will respond as quickly as possible. I'll note that all project team staff members are listed as project team or City of Lowell next to their names in the participant list. A reminder to everyone that the chat is visible to everyone, and we encourage you to keep any comments in the chat respectful to other attendees. I'd like to recognize the city staff in attendance. We have Terry Ryan, the parking director. We have Shauna Forcier from the city manager's office and Tom Lamont from the economic development office. I'd like to introduce Michael Clark from the consulting firm Stantec, who will provide more detail about the study and review the city's parking resources. Next slide.
Great. Thanks, Christine. On screen is the agenda for tonight's meeting. We'll be spending some time quickly doing some team introductions and, as Christine just discussed, some Zoom instructions. We'll review the study's purpose and goals, do an overview of parking conditions, inventory, and utilization in the Pawtucketville and Centralville neighborhoods, walk through next steps on the study, and then proceed to a short question and answer session followed by breakout rooms. Before I begin the presentation, we want to get a sense of the language preferences for the discussion portion of the meeting. We are able to offer breakout rooms for up to 4 languages, so we want to find out what rooms are requested for tonight. So in a moment, you'll see a poll pop up on your screen, and we'll ask what language preference you would have for your breakout room. We'll leave that up just for a few more seconds. And if we can see the results, you can see that we have all English preferences for tonight. So great. So we'll close that poll and proceed to the next slide. As Christine discussed, both herself and Terry are here from the city of Lowell. From Stantec, Jason Schreiber was unable to make it this evening, but he is serving as the manager for this study. And myself, Michael Clark, as well as Liza Cohen and Amelia Casey are serving as project planners. Erin Cameron from our team is also here tonight. From Regina Villa Associates, Reagan Checchio and Amanda Poggenberg are here for support on public outreach. Next slide, please. Now I'll spend a couple of minutes walking through the study's purpose and goals. Next slide. So the City of Lowell is using a housing choice grant from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development to carry out this parking study. The purpose of the study, many reasons, but 4 to particularly highlight are: first, we want to analyze the existing parking inventory and utilization, both in downtown as well as across the city. Study parking related policies and management. This includes for residential uses, as well as for offices, retail, and other uses. Compare the parking supply and demand to land uses, as well as better enable car-free lifestyles. Next slide, please. We have many goals for the study. If you log on to the Parking Studies website, we'll have a link up later in this presentation. Our larger community meeting on the 2nd walked through each of these goals in more detail, but we'll quickly walk through a few here. The first is to align parking standards with economic development goals. Another goal is to update the parking system to reflect citywide goals. Third is to improve the parking experience. Fourth is to reduce parking congestion and promote parking availability, particularly in residential neighborhoods. Fifth is to adjust parking pricing and better manage demand and system costs. This is particularly so in downtown with metered parking. Next, we're looking to streamline the city's residential parking programs. This will be a focus of discussion we'd like to hear from folks tonight. Next, we're looking to incentivize greater use of the city's parking garages. And finally, we're looking to determine future parking needs to support growth in downtown. Next slide, please. This details the study's timeline. We've been working since early fall to collect data and conduct neighborhood evaluations. We'll be walking through in just a few minutes some of the results of this data collection. We're also conducting an operational and management evaluation of the city's parking resources, such as public garages and municipal lots. This is ongoing. Third, public and stakeholder outreach efforts. You can see on the graphic that we have 2 stars. The first is for the public outreach efforts, which this meeting is a part of, as we're collecting data and looking for feedback from the community. The second will take place in the spring when we hold another public meeting to outline recommendations, as well as present findings to the City Council and release a final plan. And finally, draft and finalize parking plans, which will be starting in earnest in just a few weeks. Next slide, please. Now we'll conduct a neighborhood overview of parking resources both in Pawtucketville and in Centralville. Next slide. So before we walk through both of these neighborhoods, I do want to emphasize that our data collection efforts were not for all of the neighborhoods in Lowell. That is simply too much for the study to do. So we decided to analyze select parts of neighborhoods in the city. And in Pawtucketville, this mainly concerns the corridors around University Avenue, as well as around UMass Lowell. And in Centerville, this is largely around the Aiken Street area. So this map here details parking inventory in the parts of Pawtucketville that we studied. We have a small sliver of metered parking highlighted in yellow along University. Much of the rest of the on-street parking resources are residential permit parking or reserved on-street parking. In this instance, this is characterized largely by the residential sticker program, but it can also mean on-street spaces that are reserved for specific uses, such as church parking. Then we have small pieces of purple, which signify unregulated parking, free for anybody. Off-street parking resources, in dark blue, these are public resources offered by the city. And light blue signifies restricted parking. You can see a large amount of this parking is associated with UMass Lowell, but there's also some small restricted parking lots in the neighborhood as well. The green dots that you see on the map here signify the residential placard parking. These are the green and white signs that you'll see in your neighborhoods that signify reserved spaces in front of homes. Next slide, please. Totaling this part of the neighborhood up together, we see a little over 3,600 total parking spaces. Of these, nearly 2,200 are restricted off-street, both public and private parking. That includes large parking lots such as those associated with UMass Lowell. We see a small number, around 54, publicly available off-street parking spaces, 20 metered on-street parking spaces, and no time-limited on-street parking spaces. We have roughly 1,300 residential permit or reserved on-street parking spaces in Pawtucketville. These are spaces that are reserved primarily for residential uses. 154 residential placards are present in the neighborhood, and we have 47 unregulated parking spaces, as mentioned, that purple that you see lower left-hand side. Next slide, please. This map communicates parking utilization observed at midday. Obviously, with what has taken place over the past year, we did not want to go out and collect counts reflecting a 2020 condition, given how unlikely that is to represent long-term conditions. So our counts for Pawtucketville, Centerville, as well as throughout the city reflect aerial imagery from a Tuesday in 2016, in May 2016. Weekday, midday counts usually reflect peak operating conditions, especially in more commercial districts. And the map that you see here shows that in a largely residential neighborhood such as this, many of the spaces are vacant. So we see roughly 0 to 30% vacancy on many residential streets. However, we see higher rates of utilization with some of the off-street lots, including those with UMass Lowell, as well as near some of the commercial centers. Next slide, please. This map shows estimated parking utilization in a late evening and early morning hour. I should emphasize that these are estimates. We have been using a location-based survey service to estimate how much travel activity takes place in the overnight hours as compared to midday hours to estimate how many more cars can be observed in neighborhoods during overnight hours. So this is our best guess estimate. We would love to hear from folks if they feel that this is not accurately stating overnight parking conditions. As you can see, we see more utilized spaces across the neighborhood in an overnight condition. Roughly half of all spaces are estimated to be utilized. Next slide, please. And now for Centerville. Again, the map that was previously shown for Pawtucketville and the categories outlined here. We have much fewer spaces marked in green, on-street spaces marked in green as residential permit and reserved on-street parking due to the sticker program not being present in Centerville. Instead, we see a lot of on-street spaces signified in purple. This means that this parking is unregulated and open to all, unless there's a green sign in front of the property, in which case we understand that that space is reserved for the holder of that sign. We also see a number of more time-limited on-street parking spaces in Centerville, primarily in the commercial corridors. Off-street parking, we don't have any public parking in this neighborhood. However, we have a number of restricted parking lots. And again, green dots signify where the green and white residential placard signs exist. Next slide, please. In total, this part of Centerville features 1,400 total parking spaces. Of these, a little under half are off-street spaces, signified in the blue. We don't have any publicly available, meaning operated by the city, off-street parking spaces or any metered on-street parking spaces in Centerville. There's a small number, 73, of time-limited on-street parking spaces, as well as another small number, 26, of reserved on-street spaces for a specific use. Meanwhile, we're observing quite a bit, 716 unregulated parking on-street spaces, as well as 115 instances of residential placards. Next slide, please. Midday utilization in Centerville, we can see roughly similar story as it is in Pawtucketville. About 30% of spaces are considered to be utilized and 70% of spaces are considered to be vacant. This owes to a lot of the residential activity observed in this part of the community. You can see a number of blues, purples, maybe a little bit of green. This signifies some degree of parking utilization, but the light blue notes that these spaces are largely vacant. Next slide, please. As was done for Pawtucketville, this is an estimate of overnight parking in this portion of Centerville. As you can see, our survey data noted that we had quite a bit more activity taking place in residential parts of this study area. And we've noted that quite a bit of the on-street parking spaces near homes are utilized in the overnight hour. Again, if folks' feelings are different regarding the accuracy of this data, please let us know. I'll emphasize again that this is an estimate. The neighborhood as a whole has 56% utilization of parking during the overnight hours. And this owes to a number of off-street parking spaces associated with commercial that is empty. Next slide, please. So we'll proceed with next steps of the study before a Q&A. Next slide. So our upcoming project activities, we'll look to finish our downtown parking profile. We walked through a lot of downtown conditions at our community meeting on February 2nd, so I would encourage you to visit the website if you are interested in learning more about what was presented for downtown. As noted earlier, we'll conduct an operations evaluation of the parking system. That includes infrastructure conditions at parking lots and parking facilities, as well as financial management. We'll finish our residential parking assessments. This includes a hotspot analysis of where permits are seen, high activity of parking permits, whether it's the sticker program or residential placard signs, as well as an overall evaluation of permit programs. And finally, present recommendations as part of a final parking plan following our second round of public outreach. Next slide, please. Speaking of that outreach, we'll have a second public meeting in mid-spring, which will detail the final parking plan, the draft parking plan. And we anticipate the final parking plan to be released in early summer. Next slide. And these are project links. We will have this slide up at the end of the meeting, but you can find our project website and survey links at lowellma.gov/parking study. We'll note that the survey will be open for the rest of this week before closing at some point next week. So we do encourage you to take our online survey if you have not already done so. And you can see links here for the project's email address, as well as the Facebook page. We are using Go Lowell's Facebook page to disseminate information on the parking study as well. Next slide. So at this point, I'm going to pass it off to Reagan to facilitate our question and answers.
Hi, so I think, in an effort to get everybody into a small group discussion as soon as possible, I will just ask if there are any sort of clarifying questions for Michael before we go into the small group discussion, if there were any technical questions from his presentation that anyone has. I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, so that being said, we're going to send you into a breakout room so you'll be able to have a more interactive conversation about some of the material that has been presented so far tonight. I believe in this breakout room, there'll be two group leaders tonight. I believe both Michael and Liza will be leading the discussion, and they'll introduce themselves at the beginning of the meeting. I'll note that the breakout room discussion is not going to be recorded, unlike the main meeting, but there will be detailed notes taken during the discussion that will be incorporated into the overall written summary of the meeting. The breakout rooms will last until 7:20, so that's just probably a little under 20 minutes when we get started. At that point, we'll all rejoin the main session and we'll listen to what you've learned. So I think, Amanda, if we're ready, I think we can go into the breakout rooms. Great. So I think everyone is back from the group discussion. So welcome back. I hope it was interesting, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Michael, I don't know if you want to summarize the discussion you had in the breakout room?
Sure, I'll do my best. It was a great discussion. We heard a number of things regarding people's experiences and concerns with how parking currently works in Pawtucketville and Centralville. I think first and foremost, outreach is critical. Parking is, of course, very personal for a lot of folks, and they want to know when, where, how they can park, and to make sure that the city's overall parking system is working, both for residents of neighborhoods as well as for the city as a whole from an enforcement perspective. We did note that some of the numbers that were cited during the presentation came off perhaps not as accurate as we intended, and particularly in Centerville, to note that in the residential parts of the neighborhood, whether it is what we have been able to study or in areas that fall outside of our data collection, there is certainly a lack of on-street parking availability that might not extend to the commercial centers. And that's something that we certainly note in Centerville. And we had a lot of good discussion about really understanding where parking is available and whether that parking can be made available for residents. So it was really a need for information, and should emphasize that one of the things that we went over quickly during the goals, and perhaps we should have spent a little bit more time on, is understanding where kind of shared parking arrangements can be had. So an off-street lot in your neighborhood, such as church parking or school parking that is empty in the overnight hour, how that could potentially be used for residential parking if currently there's no good space available near a residence. And as was discussed in the context of Pawtucketville, but it's also certainly the case in Centerville as well, really a need for convenience, really having an expectation that there will be a parking space available. It might not necessarily be in front of your residence, but it won't be a search for parking every time that you're coming to your neighborhood, and there's an expectation that you should be able to find parking where you expect to find it on a consistent night-by-night basis. So yeah, it was a great discussion. I'm sure I'm missing something in there, Liza or Amelia, if there's anything more that you feel should be emphasized.
No, I think you got it, Michael. That was great. Really appreciate everyone's time. Folks in our conversation really reiterated the need to be talking with folks in the neighborhood. So reminded people that the survey is available. We've had 650 respondents so far, so we think that's good. We'd love to get more before March 1st, so please share the link with your constituents and friends so we can hear from everyone.
All right, and I'll just note before I turn it back over to Christine that the detailed notes from the discussion will be captured in the meeting summary as well for the meeting. So Christine, I will turn it back over to you.
Sorry. Thank you, Reagan. Thank you all for being here tonight and sharing your thoughts. As you can see on the screen, we have a series of neighborhood meetings coming up not a series, a neighborhood meeting tomorrow night, and then future neighborhood meetings later in the spring and early summer. And you can always drop us a line on the website, and you can fill out the survey as Liza just said. And if you have any additional thoughts, comments, you can just email us parkingstudy@lowellma.gov. Thanks again, everyone. I really appreciate your time. Good night.